we will talk about the Red Scare in the United States. And there is no like beginning of the Red Scare. Remember, this is just like a historical term, like as we look back and we're like, oh yeah, that was the Red Scare period of American history. So it's not on January 1st of whatever, 1947, where we're like, today begins the Red Scare. Everybody get extra paranoid, all right? There was already concern about communism before 1947. 47 is going to be the year that I'm kind of sticking with to start talking about this. But there was certainly concern about communism before 1947. In fact, if we went further in American history, in 1918 we had the beginning of what we call now the first Red Scare. And what would make the United States have a little bit of a Red Scare back in 1918? Yes, sir. Very good. When the Soviet Union came to fruition, when the Bolshevik Revolution happened in Russia. So we had a couple years in the late 19-teens of a paranoia in the United States that communist movement that started in Russia might make its way to the United States. All right? And some of this was well-founded because there were absolutely communists in the United States. There were terrorist attacks and there were anarchists in the United States at the turn of the century. So there was some legitimate concern that this could be a threat to American values. But that is going to be nothing like we're going to see in the 1940s and into the 50s. Now, who was president of the United States in 1947? Harry Truman. And what political party does he belong to? He is a Democrat. The Democrats have had a stranglehold on American politics to this point all the way since the 1930s. All right? Republicans ran the government at the beginning of the Great Depression, and that did not bode well for their long-term prospects of getting elected. Franklin Roosevelt wins, the Democrats win the Congress in 1930 elections. Franklin Roosevelt wins the presidency for the Democrats in 1932. And then they hold on to that all the way through World War II. So by 1947, President Truman, he's a Democrat. Now we often hear of this divide between those that are like strongly against communism being Republicans and those that maybe are like more apathetic or more willing to coexist as being Democrats. And I don't think we can say that. We do certainly see, though, the political right in America, like the Republican conservative right, as being vehemently anti-communist. Now, really quickly, let me just, in a very quick nutshell, explain the differences between the conservative political right in the United States and the liberal democratic left in terms of government control of economic issues. Because that's really the biggest difference between the capitalist world and the communist world, is how much control is the government going to have over economic issues. In America today and in the 1930s, the political right occupied by the Republican Party, we would also call them conservatives, they tend to believe that the federal government should stay out of individuals' economic lives and businesses' economic lives as much as possible. They believe in far less governmental regulation of business and industry. As we make our way across the political spectrum and head to the left, we come to the Democratic Party, who believes that the federal government should take a more active role in the economic well-being of the nation. More oversight over industry. And we see this very clearly with the story of the Great Depression. The argument against the Hoover administration, he was the Republican president when the Depression started, was that they didn't do enough to solve the problems of the Depression. And so Roosevelt wins the election in 1932, and he comes in with a bevy of new plans and programs, governmental programs, to put Americans to work and to reshape our banking industry and all kinds of other things. And this is the federal government taking a far greater role in the economic lives of American businesses and individuals. Franklin Roosevelt and his government established the Social Security program, an old age insurance program for all Americans. This is the government taking a more active role in individuals' economic lives. And it shouldn't be surprising if we're at the right and government's not taking much role at all, and we move our way over to the left and government's taking a more active role. If we keep wandering towards the left on the spectrum, what do we end up getting to? Yeah, socialism and communism, where government is taking control over everything, right? And that's why we tend to associate the right, the political right, the Republicans that are furthest away from that idea, as being the most rabidly anti-communist folks. But please hear this and understand, both in the United States, the political right in the 1940s, and the political left in the United States, the Democratic Party in the 1940s, they were both anti-communist. You can be a Democrat, but still like the idea of free enterprise. You can be a Democrat and still be a business owner. You see this a lot today, like a guy like Mark Zuckerberg. You heard of him, right? He's the multi-billionaire owner and creator of Facebook. That guy is very liberal. But he also started like one of the most successful businesses of recent history. And he makes billions of dollars off of his ideas and his work. So, anyhow, my point is to say that we often associate Republicans during this early Cold War period as being the ones that were against communism. But so are Democrats. And we need to remember that Harry Truman was the president of the United States in 1947. All right? And so Harry Truman, who's got the placard on his own desk that says the buck stops here, he gets to make a lot of decisions on his own. And in 1947, he is going to issue what's called the Executive Order 9835. President issues an executive order. This is like a presidential dictate that calls for formal loyalty tests for government employees. So if you are working for the federal government, you have to take a loyalty test to the United States, to pledge your oath of loyalty to the United States and to defend our Constitution. And if you have any links with communist groups or the Communist Party itself, that could lead to your dismissal from your job. Executive Order 9835. Thousands of Americans would be dismissed because they would not do well on these loyalty tests, or they would refuse to take such oaths because they themselves saw it as a violation of their constitutional rights. So we would see thousands of governmental employees removed from their jobs because of this. And this was a Democratic president's order. All right? He didn't have to do this. Now, we could have the debate whether he really wanted to do it or whether he was just responding to political pressure that he was getting from the political right. Because what does President Truman have to worry about in 1948? He's got to run for president again. And he's got every member of the House of Representatives running for office. And he's got a third of the Democrats in Senate running for office. So he's got to think about these things. But it's really hard to know what's in his heart of hearts. In his letters and his memoirs, he did express regret for this. But at the time, it's hard to know. In 1947, Congress will pass what is called the National Security Act. It's another big step of the Truman response to the early Cold War. Now, when we say National Security Act, whenever you see that phrase, that word act at the end of something, that is a law that Congress passes. So at one point, the National Security Act was just a lonely bill sitting on Capitol Hill, hoping to make it to committee, and one day he could maybe get enough votes and be passed by the House and by the Senate, and then signed into law by the President, so that lonely bill could one day become an act of Congress, an actual law. The National Security Act becomes that. So in 1947, here's what the National Security Act did. It does three things that I need you guys to be aware of. Number one, it creates the Department of Defense to oversee all branches of the armed forces. It's kind of wild. It took us a long time a lot of history before we actually had a Department of Defense. Before this time, we had a Secretary of War who was like in charge of the Army. Then we had a Secretary of the Navy who was in charge of the Air Force. I'm kidding, that would make no sense. Secretary of the Navy, who was in charge of the Navy. There was no Secretary of the Air Force because there was no Air Force. That was actually a part of the Army, and it was called, Kevin? The Army, the Air Force was called during World War II? The Army Air Corps. So there was no Air Force. The Department of Defense, though, will be created with this National Security Act, and it will also, within the National Security Act, create a separate Air Force. So now we will have the Army and the Navy and the Air Force as separate military branches. Now, I didn't mention the Marines. They're kind of within the envelope of the Navy. This creation of the Air Force is important, especially in the story of the Cold War, because they're going to be the guys that are in charge of our nuclear arsenal. So if you had dreams of one day joining the military and being one of those individuals that has your finger on the bomb, right, on the finger on the button, and you could launch a weapon that might bring an end to the world, the Air Force is where you go. We still have guys that are sitting in missile 24/7. They sit in missile silos out in Montana and Wyoming. What's that? You went to one of those? That they didn't have a missile in it anymore. No. Yeah, we've closed a lot of them down. Yeah, those are kind of like secret. All right, very interesting though. Big though, right? Like incredible big, right? So anyway, this is all coming out of the National Security Act. So now we have separate military branches that all answer to one Secretary of Defense appointed to the President to better align what these military branches are working on. The National Security Act will also create a body known as the National Security Council. The National Security Council is a group of advisors to the President on issues of defense and national security. It's not surprising here. They kind of do what they're called. And we talked the other day about NSC 68, National Security Council Report 68, right? That's where that came from. The National Security Act will also establish the CIA. Now this is confusing for a lot of kids who mix up the CIA and the FBI. Sterling Heights, Michigan has a police department, and they enforce laws of Sterling Heights, Michigan. And the state of Michigan has a police department that enforces state law. And the federal government has a police department. It's called the FBI that enforces federal law. The CIA is separate from that. The CIA is an intelligence gathering outfit, typically overseas. This is if you want to be a spy, right? This is where you go. You go to the CIA. You don't go to the FBI to be a spy. You go to the FBI to be a federal police officer. You go to the CIA to be a spy, or to be to gather information, or to translate information that might be coming out of foreign nations. That's what the CIA is up to. So obviously this is going to be creating a lot more government offices and government jobs for work on defending the United States against overseas threats. Also passed by Congress in 1950 now. It would be vetoed by President Truman, but ultimately that veto would be overturned in 1950. The McCarran Internal Security Act, the McCarran Internal Security Act. McCarran. Just named after the senator that originated the bill. The McCarran Internal Security Act. It's an act of Congress passed in 1950. It's going to do four main things. First, it will require communist organizations in the United States to register themselves with the Federal Attorney General. So if you are a communist organization in the United States, you have to let it be known that you are a communist organization with the United States and get your name on a list with the Attorney General. We'll talk about that in a moment. The McCarran Act will also create what's known as the Subversive Activities Control Board. When I say subversive activities, subversive would mean to get under the United States and try to bring us down from within. Subversive Activities Control Board that would be tasked with investigating activities of individuals that are accused of trying to bring the country down. The McCarran Act will also allow, if the president deems it necessary, in the time of crisis, although it's not defined as what a crisis, how serious a crisis must be before this could happen, it allows for the president to detain subversives in a time of crisis. Essentially putting individuals in camps, maybe like we did in the 1940s during World War II, after Executive Order 9066, where President Roosevelt interned Japanese Americans on the West Coast. So you guys, I see a lot of eyes right now kind of making some connections and thinking that this is problematic. Essentially, the McCarran Act says, hey, if you're a communist organization, you've got to tell us who you are, right? And then they're setting up a process by which later, in a time of crisis, we could round up all of those people, if need be. This should make you think to just a couple weeks ago, when there's a lot of talk in the news about Donald Trump and then Ben Carson talking about, a registered list of Muslims in America. And why some people find that so problematic. Why some people think that is a serious issue, right? Or oversight of mosques around the country. And I think we can also understand why some people might think that would be an important thing to do even if we don't agree with it. We can see that this is not an unprecedented act in American history, right? This McCarran Act would also make picketing federal courthouses a felony offense. Picketing is like carrying picket signs and protesting. Sure.
So like protesting in front of?
In front of a federal courthouse. Now, when you hear these things that this McCarran Act did, you should think possibly about our First Amendment, right? It doesn't seem like people would have very much freedom of speech or freedom to peaceably assemble if this is the situation that they're operating under. For example, it's not illegal, and never has it been illegal for an American to join the Communist Party. But now this is saying if you join that party, if you join some communist group, your group has to register itself with the federal government. And that possibly in a time of crisis, who knows, you might be detained because of your political beliefs. And this is problematic if you kind of read our Constitution as it's written. Now, this, of course, in the 1950s, whose job is it in our federal government to decide whether this is constitutional or not? Supreme Court. But they're also the ones that get to decide whether or not they're going to even hear cases. The Supreme Court decides what they're going to hear or what they're not going to hear. So in the 1950s, there's not really any movement to challenge this law by the Supreme Court. In the 60s, when climate changes a little bit, that will change, and aspects and eventually all of this McCarran Act will be overturned. But I think this, maybe more than anything else, should make you think about what's going on in our country today. There is a great film, and I would encourage you guys to watch it. And it was, I remember I saw it not long after it first came out. I think it was 97 or 98. It's a movie starring Denzel Washington called The Siege. Has anybody seen this one? Might have, might not have. It's really good. And today it's probably even more powerful and frightening than it was back when it first came out. It's the story of a terrorist attack in New York City. And this is in like 97, 98 it came out. Now this is not, and the terrorists were like radical Islamists. And when this movie came out, that was not like beyond the realm of anybody's belief, because you guys may or may not know in 93 the World Trade Center was bombed. There was an attempt by Al-Qaeda to bring down the World Trade Center. They drove a truck filled with explosives into the parking garage below the World Trade Center. They detonated it. Some people were killed. Many more were injured. But the buildings, of course, did not fall down. So a few years later, this movie comes out. And it's Hollywood's attempt to get us to think about what might happen if this kind of thing happens again or continues to happen in our country. And in the movie, they push it pretty far. And as the film goes on, there's obviously a lot of Americans who are very afraid, and a lot of Muslims who are being targeted, and obviously the vast majority of them are absolutely innocent. But the movie presses on and starts to actually in turn, Muslim Americans in the late 1990s. And at the time, it was a powerful and kind of eye-opening, frightening movie. And today, I think it's even more so. But there's precedent that our country has kind of acted like this before if we go back to the Cold War. I encourage you guys to check that out if you need a movie night. It's good stuff. All right, everyone good? Okay, we're going to go a little bit further. Got 2 more topics to talk about. The next one is HUAC. Excuse me. The House Un-American Activities Committee. HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. The House Un-American Activities Committee is a House of Representatives committee that would investigate what they deemed as un-American activities. Kind of says it right in its name. It was born in 1937. Why would a committee like this be born in 1937? This is long before the Red Scare. Yeah, Kevin.
Back then it was more about like Nazis and fascism.
Very good. It was born in 1937 as a challenge to fascism and the spread of fascism. And so if you were seen maybe as somebody who was supporting fascist movements, because by 1937 we get a growth of Nazi Germany, we get an Italian invasion of Abyssinia, in 1937 we have Japan invading mainland China. Maybe if you are in cahoots with those ideas, you might be dragged before the House Un-American Activities Committee. But then as we get into World War II, that doesn't really go very far. And the House Un-American Activities Committee doesn't disappear, but it doesn't do much. But with the advent of the Cold War, the House Un-American Activities Committee picks up steam again. And they begin to investigate, among other things, links between Hollywood and the communist left. There were over 300 members of the Communist Party in the United States that lived in and around the Hollywood area. And absolutely some of them worked in film. They were directors, they were actors, they were screenwriters, they were producers. And in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee began to give summons to hundreds of these Hollywood figures to go to Washington, D.C. and testify before this committee. Testify as to whether or not they are a communist, or they know communist activities, or they've seen other communist activities within Hollywood. Now, why so concerned with Hollywood? Darshal. Absolutely. The things Hollywood produces influences us today, right? Has anybody been influenced by a Hollywood film ever? Have you ever changed your thinking because of something you saw? What is that? No, not a movie that I should hear about? Okay. Creed, that makes you want to fight? All right, okay. I saw Creed the other day, and I really liked it. And it made me look into the actor that played Creed, and it made me look into the director of the film. And it turns out those 2 guys worked on a previous film that's on Netflix right now. It's called Fruitvale Station. And I watched it the other night with my wife, and it was excellent. It's about a young African-American man in San Francisco, or Oakland, California. And in 2009, on New Year's Eve, on 2009, he was shot and killed by a police officer at this train station. And it was recorded on individual cell phones that were there. And this became like the first, unfortunately, or maybe the most prolific of now what we almost see time and time again in our society of African-American men, young African-American men, who maybe are running into overzealous police officers, right? And this film obviously has an opinion on this topic. This film obviously has an opinion on this topic. It is quite sympathetic towards the young man who was shot and killed. And from reading more about him, it seems like it should have been sympathetic towards him. But that is a Hollywood film that is absolutely trying to influence how its viewers think about things. And not only that issue, but like all of the other similar ones that we see today. So absolutely Hollywood tries to influence us, right? Well, the concern in the 1940s was Hollywood was trying to turn us into communists. Hollywood was trying to make us think like leftists. So the House Un-American Activities Committee began to call Hollywood actors and Hollywood screenwriters and Hollywood directors to D.C. to testify. Most did. Most went. Most testified. And most went about their lives and went back to Hollywood and went on with their careers. Some refused. This is a group known as the Hollywood 10. One member of this group, his name is Dalton Trumbo. You guys read Johnny Got His Gun last year, I believe, in your history class. He was the author of that. He was also a screenwriter in Hollywood. And right now, a brand new movie just came out with Bryan Cranston, the guy that played Walter White in Breaking Bad, about Dalton Trumbo and his life. So you'd probably be interested in seeing that. He was one of this Hollywood 10 that refused to go to Washington, D.C. to answer these questions. Well, when Congress calls you to answer questions, you have to go. And if you don't, you could be found to be in contempt of Congress. Just like you watch court shows and get in trouble for being in contempt of court, like you're not doing what the judge is ordering you to do. Well, now you get in trouble for that. These guys were accused of contempt of Congress. And they all received sentences in jail of 6 to 12 months. They're known as the Hollywood 10. One of them eventually started talking, and he testified. He was a director. His name was Edward Mitte. And I apologize, he is Russian, and his name doesn't have enough vowels for me to say correctly. It is Dmytrky. It's a Russian name. He eventually testified. And he eventually testified and named over 24 members of the Communist Party that were working in Hollywood. And he also stated before the House Un-American Activities Committee that he was pressured to have communist themes in films. And this is going to allow the House Un-American Activities Committee to pat itself on the back and say, see, we told you so. They are trying to influence how we Americans think. This is one small example. Most members of Hollywood supported. Most members of Hollywood went along with the questions that they were made to answer. One prominent individual you should be familiar with is this guy. Anyone know who he is? No? Say, who? It is Ronald Reagan. Very good. Ronald Reagan, President of the United States in the 1980s, was an actor in Hollywood in the 1940s. And he was a very prominent actor. He was not like a small bit part guy. He was a Hollywood leading man. And Ronald Reagan was the president of the Screen Actors Guild, the Actors Union. And he testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee. And you'll notice here, just as a sign of the times, this is Ronald Reagan testifying, and there's an ashtray right in front of him, because everybody smoked back in the 40s. But anyway, even when you're testifying before, can you imagine someone going before Congress now and testifying and having a cigarette right next to him? That's how the world worked back then. Ronald Reagan, yeah, maybe. Yeah, the cigarette lobby. Ronald Reagan testified before the House Un-American Activities Committee, and he helped them build what would ultimately be known as the Blacklist, a list of communist sympathizers or known communists within Hollywood that would then find it impossible to do any work in that city again. Because no one would want to hire these blacklisted actors, or these blacklisted directors, or these blacklisted screenwriters. Because then you yourself might become blacklisted. Good? Questions? Good? Yes, sir.
When did it become released that he was one of the people that helped?
Ronald Reagan?
Yeah.
It was common knowledge that Ronald Reagan, as part of the Screen Actors Guild, went to the House Un-American Activities Committee. That was...
But, was it common knowledge that you communists or sympathized with the government?
Yeah, that's... But it wasn't unpopular to do that. And most of Hollywood would have been... most people aren't the Hollywood 10. All right, they're the 10. Of the thousands of people that work in Hollywood, they're the 10 that kind of stood out. So Ronald Reagan was not unpopular for that at that time. And Ronald Reagan is a guy that will eventually run for president as being a strong anti-communist candidate. And he'll ultimately win the presidency, so it doesn't hurt him either. We're going to close today with talking about this man, Mentioned him yesterday. This is Senator Joseph McCarthy. Not to be confused with Douglas MacArthur, the general in Korea. This is Joe McCarthy. He was a Wisconsin senator. And he went on a one-man crusade to rid the federal government from communist influence. He was a chairman of a Senate committee, or subcommittee, I should say, called the Senate Permanent Investigation Subcommittee. You guys probably don't need to remember that. Just know he was a senator. And he would call on government officials to testify before his committee. In 1950, he's going to claim in a speech that he gives in West Virginia, he's going to claim to have a list of over 200 names of known communists that are working in the U.S. State Department. And he uses this list as an example of communist infiltration of the American government. And why should we be afraid about communists in our government? What's that? Well, because we're capitalists, sure. They're working from the inside to bring us down. What happened in Czechoslovakia? Communists from in the government drove out the non-communists. There's precedent for this kind of stuff happening. So Joe McCarthy says he's got this list of 205 known communists in the U.S. State Department. And he says in that same speech, don't write this down, just hear it, "Today we are engaged in a final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. The modern champions of communism have selected this as the time, and ladies and gentlemen, the chips are down. They are truly down." Okay. Listen to this rhetoric. We are at as low a time as we could possibly be. This threat is real. They're all around us. Really echoes with a lot of what we're hearing today, right? This is what's referred to by modern viewers as the communist witch hunts of the 1950s. In fact, you guys might have heard of a playwright named Arthur Miller, maybe? Arthur Miller wrote a play called The Crucible. And that play was about the Salem witch trials of the late 1600s. But it was written in the 1950s. So it was an allegory for what Arthur Miller saw as the communist witch hunts of Joseph McCarthy. But there's a problem with this analogy. In the 90s? In 1690 in Salem, Massachusetts, were there any witches? No. Witches aren't real. They're not. There were no witches in Salem, Massachusetts. Ever. There were no witches anywhere. There are people that call themselves witches, but they're just putting weird potions together, but they're not really doing any magic or anything like that. All right? What's that? No, remember the old dunk test. When you put the witch underwater to see if she survives that drowning, and if she survives, you know she was a witch, and then you have to figure out what other way to kill her, because that's going to be tricky. I wonder if they ever thought that out. Like, what do we do if she is a witch? Like, that is problematic. Like, oh man, she drowned. Whew, she's in heaven, so she's okay now. She won't be mad at us because now she's up above. You never think about what happens if they actually do get one that survives, and then like what do you do then? You know, and well, whatever. She'd been allowed. A good witch would have been like poof and like moved aside so you can't tie her up or catch her. Anyhow, in Salem, Massachusetts, in the 17th century, there were no witches. In the United States, in 1950, there were communists and there were Soviet spies. So it's not a perfect analogy, but the analogy is used. Let me give you a couple examples of real-life Soviet espionage that actually hurt the American cause. First, there's a guy named Alger Hiss. He worked for the State Department in the 1930s. And he was ultimately found guilty of perjury, that's lying under oath, and he was found to have passed classified information onto the Soviets back in the 1930s. So Alger Hiss is a real live Soviet spy in the United States government. What's that? Yes, he was a real snake. Good stuff. Another individual, Klaus Fuchs, Fuchs. Klaus Fuchs confessed to spying while working on the Manhattan Project and passing information off to the Soviet Union. He also, in his testimony, implicated these individuals. This is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Husband and wife. Julius worked within the Manhattan Project. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg would be put on trial for treason, for passing classified information on to the Soviets. And they would each be found guilty, and they would each be executed by the electric chair. Because treason in the United States is like the one crime that's mentioned in the Constitution. Can't do that. These two became a cause célèbre, like kind of martyrs of the far left in the United States and the communist sympathizers in the United States. But as more evidence came out over the years, and certainly as modern evidence, as Soviet documents were able to be viewed, it turns out, yeah, this guy especially, Julius Rosenberg, he was definitely up to no good. And his wife we're not as sure of. Of her level of involvement, but she ultimately would fall with him. In 1950, the U.S. Senate would establish a committee to investigate threats to national security. And Joseph McCarthy would eventually lead this committee as well. And he began looking deeper in the federal government for communist threats and communist spies. He would receive tremendous support from Christian organizations, as he used in his rhetoric, like I just read you, the idea that communism was an atheistic faith, whereas the United States supported Christian ideologies. Yes, ma'am?
So is a Senate to establish what?
To just look deeper into communist infiltration within the federal government. A new committee to investigate threats to national security and connections within the United States government to communist activity. This is the era that under God will make its appearance in our Pledge of Allegiance. All right? To let it be known that the United States, as far as those that wanted it there believed, was based in Judeo-Christian values, while the communist, atheist Soviet Union was the opposite of that. Ultimately, Joseph McCarthy would experience his fall by 1954 as he began to accuse members of the United States Army as being infiltrated by Soviet spies. And as McCarthy was televised in these hearings, starting to lose it in his accusations against the American military, he began to lose popular favor around the country. And he eventually would be out of the U.S. Senate. But McCarthy and the House Un-American Activities Committee are maybe the two poster children we can use for the American government investigating and possibly overstepping its bounds in investigating communism within the United States.